outside. Thank you. Our last speaker of the group is Dr. James Cusamano, and we've invited him particularly to address the subject of molecular engineering and catalytic materials. Jim?
Well, thank you, Alice, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. This is actually the second time that I've had the opportunity and privilege to address this distinguished symposium. The first time was almost 20 years ago when I presented my thesis research at this same symposium in Atlantic City. And that was a rather detailed technical presentation. The presentation that I'm going to give you today, although it will have some chemistry and chemical engineering, will indeed be more of a philosophical presentation. I guess that's the license that one is allowed after 20 years. Hopefully some wisdom will come forth with that. Now, my objective is to do something that I believe this symposium is doing, but perhaps in a more focused way, and that is to remind you of the tremendous progress that we have made in catalysis research and development over the past several years. And indeed, I believe we have entered the era of molecular engineering, of catalytic materials, and process technology. Now, I want to make two things clear. I'd like to go to two comments that my good friend Jim Roth made. Indeed, I am not talking about a priori catalyst design where one can sit down at a computer and design a catalyst, although I believe in our lifetime we will move substantially towards that direction, or towards that goal. Second of all, Jim made a very interesting point at the end of his presentation, and I concur with it wholeheartedly, and that is, if we are to get on a new growth curve and to create new technology, we need to look for discontinuities. And I would propose to you that the methodology of molecular engineering in concert with good chemical engineering and an eye to the marketplace will make that happen. Now I'm going to focus primarily on industrial catalysis, although to be sure much of what I say will have general applicability. I asked myself, what is the most critical thing that one has to have in order to be able to do molecular engineering? And I came up with a one-word answer, and that is commitment. One needs to develop people and environment. You need to have lots of equipment. Some of it's quite expensive. You need to draw on data from a multiplicity of various areas of research, and to be able to use that in a very clever way. And I wanted to find a way to relate to you my idea about commitment. So if I can have the first slide. And bring the lights down, please. This is a story of a chicken and a pig who are walking down the rural road, and they come across this billboard, which, as you can see, says, "Have a solid breakfast." And the chicken says to the pig, "Isn't it wonderful how we are feeding humanity? My colleagues and I are laying eggs by the dozens every day. Look at those luscious eggs up on the plate, those two crisp pieces of bacon. I really feel committed to feeding humanity." And the pig looked up at that billboard and looked the chicken in the eye, and he says, "Let me tell you about commitment." That's a message especially for all of you who are involved in research management. It takes time, it takes commitment, and it's not something that you can turn on and off. Now, what I'm going to do is very quickly talk about the opportunity for developing advanced catalytic technology by the methodology of molecular engineering. I'm going to say something very briefly about economic incentives. Some words have been said previously by a couple of the speakers. I'll tell you what I mean by molecular engineering. We'll give some examples and then look to future directions. Indeed, when you think about the opportunity, it simply flows from the technology requirements today. The world has changed with respect to the chemical industry, and I think you're well aware of it, but let me just remind you. We need to develop process technology which uses low-cost raw materials. We need to have simple process design for low capital investment, ease of operation, and I assure you, not only economy on large scale, but economy on small scale. And we don't have time to go into this, but economy on small scale and capital investment are very closely related. Third, minimal energy requirements. I think, as Alex pointed out, sure, the oil embargo came about and the price of oil has gone down, but I can assure you, in my view, in the 1990s, we will see a resurgence, and I think we're seeing it move in that direction already with increased oil prices. And finally, this needs no explanation. The world indeed has changed in this area. Environmental compatibility and safety go without question. Catalysis addresses every one of those issues. Now, the economics, the number $750 billion of materials, primary materials, seeing a catalytic step, greater than 25% of our gross national product. That number comes from catalytic, and it was developed about 4 years ago in a study that we did. I'd like to point out another one, which was recently announced by Intel, where they point out that innovative catalysis in molecular engineering could save more than $100 billion in the United States alone over the next 15 years. Now, what is this thing we call molecular engineering? Very simple. We start with a hypothesis, we synthesize materials, we characterize them, we test them, we post-characterize, and we modify and go around this loop until we have a product or a process. Well, that looks pretty much like what we've been doing in catalysis research for the past few decades, and indeed it is. The big difference is the size of these boxes have changed. We now have a whole host of materials that we can draw upon from material science, from inorganic chemistry, organic chemistry. And I don't have to convince this audience that there is a whole arsenal of equipment by which we can characterize materials above and beyond what we could even conceive of 10 years ago. We truly have become molecular observers for catalytic materials. And if you're really doing your homework, there are ways to test catalysts right now in automated conditions to get data in such a way that we can do perhaps 10 times better than we did 10 years ago. And so all I'm saying is that the size of these boxes have changed, and if we want to, during the discussion period, we can go to some examples of that. And our ability to go around this circle and come up with a new product or process is at least an order of magnitude better than it was a decade ago. So if you want a simple definition, it's not a priori design, but it certainly is the application of our knowledge base in pure and applied sciences to design of catalytic systems for specific performance characteristics. Now, what are the benefits of this molecular engineering approach? First of all, high information content to guide our research decisions. Increased probability of major discoveries, and I think we can go through some of them. You've seen some in prior slides from some of the prior speakers. It's a very cost-effective process when done right. It leads to greater scientific understanding, and if you're in industrial catalysis like I am, let me stress this last one, strong patents. We in the chemical industry live by strong patents, as well as in the energy industry. And I think if you look at the patent literature over the last decade, you will see an increased number of patents with NMR spectra, with XAP data, with all kinds of instrumentation, because many of the materials that are being patented may have prior art where they are the same nominal composition, but surface composition or structures may be different. And these tools are necessary and important to distinguish new materials from old materials which may be different in those ways. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this, but I want to put it before you because if you're doing industrial catalysis, this is a whole talk in itself. And it's a very critical one. It's an important philosophy, and I can tell you it's the cornerstone of our company at Catalytic. And that is, those companies who are successful in innovation and industry do this. They closely integrate research, engineering, and the market. And they do it at a very early stage, preferably at the beginning of research. And it takes a talent to be able to do this, to have the right dynamic equilibrium so that you don't quench research ideas. But being aware of critical engineering facts that will impact on the research or the market. And I'll give you some examples which will show that. Now, there are a lot of examples and technologies that were discussed by prior speakers. I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list, but I have pulled from the literature a few things that I think exemplify the concept of molecular engineering. And I'd like to put them before you. Water-soluble rhodium hyperformylation catalyst, molecular shape selective catalyst, and ring opening metathesis. Let's take the first one. In this particular innovation, which was developed at Brewer-Camus and Rome-Poulenc, they have developed a catalyst which is soluble in water to bring about the hyperformylation of lower olefins, in this case propylene, to butyraldehyde. Now this is a reaction that's been carried out for a number of years. The first catalysts were cobalt. Later on there were developments going to rhodium catalysts to get higher normal to iso ratios. There are three key problems with this process though. In boiling off the butyraldehyde from the reactor, the catalyst undergoes stress and in many cases undergoes partial decomposition. The second problem is that you cannot practice conventional oxochemistry on higher olefins in the way it's practiced today, because if you have to boil off a higher molecular weight material, clearly you're going to stress the catalyst even further. And thirdly, the exothermic energy of a reaction in a conventional oxochemistry is used to boil off the products. Therefore, it's not available as to produce high-quality steam and to be integrated into the process externally. So these gentlemen at Rome-Poulenc and Brewer-Camus addressed these three issues, and they produced and engineered a catalyst which generically looks like this. It's a rhodium triphenylphosphine, where they have developed the methodology to meta-substitute a sulfonate and an alkyl group. And by tuning the alkyl and the sulfonate, they can tune the oleophilicity and the hydrophilicity of this particular catalyst to maximize solubility in water and yet still have the optimal interaction with the olefin to maximize selectivity and conversion. And this is a good example where not only by molecular engineering have they gotten higher activities and therefore can operate at lower temperatures, higher selectivities, lower pressures, but energy savings are substantial and economically have a profound impact on this process. It leads to process simplification. The reactor is smaller. You can phase separate the butyraldehyde from the water and just throw it off the reactor. You can run it through a heat exchanger and generate steam. And that is a very important part of the overall economics. Finally, when you think about the market, it's applicable to higher olefins. This is a good example where market and engineering had an impact on the chemistry and the molecular engineering design of the catalyst. What about shape selectivity? Well, there's a whole host of materials, and many of them are being discussed today, or this week at this symposium. Molecular sieves, zeolites, sapros, the materials developed by union carbide, layered materials such as molecularly engineered layer structures, the materials that we're developing in catalytica, clays, even very unusual organic systems, porphyrins, taurines, and cyclodextrins, and of course materials which have optical activity, induced optical activity, chiral structures. I'd like to just give you a few examples to remind us, again, of the progress that we've made. Now, I'm not going to dwell on zeolites because I think there's been some very fine papers presented over the past couple of weeks, but I would like to go to a technique that I think over the next few years can have a profound impact in molecular engineering catalysts. And the technique is molecular graphics. This is a picture which was taken on a workstation produced by Silicon Graphics, one of our neighbors in Silicon Valley. And in this particular case, you see the molecule, it's a double helix of DNA. The interesting thing that one can do with these particular graphic packages is that you can not only project molecules, you can dot molecules, you can move them in real time, and you can do energy calculations. And the ability to do those energy calculations and to be able to see how molecules fit, I would contend will have very important impact on areas of catalysis and molecular engineering over the near future. I'd like to just quickly go through a few slides. These are produced by John Thomas at his laboratory while he was at Cambridge. Here's a phagicide framework. This is a picture of ethane in a phagicide supercage. Here's azo-isobutyrnitrile in a pocket-site supercage. And here is the much talked about ZSM-5, where John has pictured really one of the tunnels, just one of the straight tunnels, and looking at several molecules, you can see why 2,2-dimethylpentane is sterically hindered in going into that structure. This is a picture of benzene in ZSM-5, and then finally, this is an energy calculation for benzene moving down one of the tunnels in silicate. This is just one more tool from the arsenal that gives us very interesting insight into molecular engineering of various materials. Now, I'd like to move to another example of shape selectivity, and here I'd like to talk about materials that we're working on in Catalytica, molecularly engineered layer structures, or MELS. These materials are produced by reacting a tetravalent cation with a phosphonic acid, and what one gets is an inorganic organic polymer. The inorganic is contained in these layers, the phosphorus, oxygen, and let's say we have a tetravalent cation like zirconium. Pendant from the phosphorus is the R group, or the alkyl group, or whatever it may be, and it can literally be hundreds of materials. Now these materials have interesting properties. They can be synthesized from very simple phosphonic acids, for example, or by mixing phosphonic acids where the circle and the triangle represent two different phosphonic acids. We can then induce the statistical distribution in the layered material, moving down to a more sophisticated design by reacting a simple phosphonic acid and a biphosphonic acid. We can pillar these materials and begin to build in shape selectivity by design. Now, if you want to go even further, this is a MELS intercalated cyclodextrin, where you have two rows of cyclodextrin molecules between the layers. This is a fairly sophisticated, complicated, and expensive catalyst, and would only find application in very high-value areas, this particular one, for example, in the synthesis of pharmaceuticals. Now, I'd like to go back to instrumentation, which I mentioned earlier is so critical in molecular engineering of catalytic materials. In our work on MELS, we have used a number of instrumental tools to characterize the systems we're designing and building. And this is a scheme which is involved in the synthesis of MELS. It looks very similar, for example, if you were going to synthesize a zeolite. One instrument that we have found to be very significant in understanding the molecular structure of these materials is solid-state, liquid-state, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. And we invested very early on in a 400 MSL Bruegel instrument, which has the capability to give us very detailed information on these materials. Let me give you an example. One of the things that we have done is to develop these materials as solid acids for various applications. And one application is to replace resins, resins like polystyrenes, sulfonated polystyrene dibenzene resins, ion exchange resins, because we wanted to build into this structure high thermal stability. We wanted to also build a high site density, and we also wanted to be able to tailor the site. For example, in this particular example, we have a sulfophenyl MEL. This is just one of the layers, and we have the ability to put R groups, where those R groups can be many different things. Alkyl groups, they can be oleophilic, they can be hydrophilic, and change the kinetics of a reaction around the active site. Now, in order to understand the stability of these materials, we have used NMR. For example, using cross-polarization magic angle spin NMR of phosphorus 31, we can look at the inorganic structure. We can understand, is it homogeneous? Do we have mixed phases? We can understand the concentration of the two species that we're putting into the structure. By looking at carbon-13 NMR, CP mass, we can look at the organic part of the structure and understand under various conditions, is it decomposing, and what indeed is the structure, where is the sulfonic acid group, etc. Now, this is a rather simplified view in looking at the stability of these materials, where we're comparing the inorganic polymer, the MEL, with an ion exchange resin using NMR. And as you can see, in the case of the resin, in the presence of steam at 200 degrees centigrade, the NMR spectrum changes substantially, whereas that is not the case for the MELS material. This is shown more dramatically on the next slide, where we have plotted the percent sulfonic acid groups as a function of time, 200 degrees C in steam. And you can see the MELS material is stable. Again, to design these materials, NMR has played a very critical role in our molecular engineering materials. Now, I'd like to move to the last example of shape selectivity, and that is of chirality, optically active isomers. I'd like to remind you that optical isomers can have profoundly different properties. In this case, with limonene, for example, if you have the S isomer, it's a lemon odor. If you have the R isomer, it's an orange odor. If you go to something like penicillamine, which is a very active drug for arthritis and anti-arthritic, the R isomer is extremely toxic. Propranolol, one of the most highly prescribed drugs for heart disease, particularly a beta blocker, the S isomer is very, very active, whereas the R isomer is a contraceptive. Very interesting kind of distinction. Now, there's been a lot of very fine molecular engineering, very fine science that's gone on in the past 10 years to design catalysts to be able to make these kind of molecules. For example, propranolol. And I'll point just one example. That's the work of Barry Sharpless at Stanford and then subsequently at MIT, where he has developed catalysts, titanium isopropoxide in conjunction with other materials, which can bring in oxygen at the top of a prochiral substrate or at the bottom to make optically active epoxides in very high yields and very high EEs. Here's an example of the synthesis of disprolor, which is a pheromone for insecticide. Now, the last example I'd like to concentrate on is some recent work that was reported by Bob Grubbs and his group from Caltech and Dick Schrock, his group from MIT. And that's a fascinating chemistry that they have been developing for ring opening metathesis. And this particular metathesis polymerization scheme can lead to new types of polymers. It gives us a new handle on polymeric materials, and it produces what are called living polymers. By living polymers, I mean that the catalyst is contained at the end of the growing link. And so one can actually bring about polymerization by putting in monomer to the catalyst, and once the monomer is stopped reacting, the polymerization stops. And you can keep that in a jar, go back 2 weeks later, put more monomer in, and start the polymerization again, because the catalyst is at the end of that link. Now, these are two catalysts. This is a titanium carbene and a tungsten carbene. Both do very similar types of chemistry. One of the neat things about the tungsten and more recently molybdenum carbenes developed by Schrock is they appear to be tolerant of heteroatoms like oxygen. Now, here are some of the things that one can do. Starting with that catalyst and your bornene, you can make polymer bornene. And again, one of the interesting things that one can do is to make very narrow molecular weight materials, very, very low polydispersity. Now, you see the catalyst is contained at the end of the link. Basically, all of the links are growing at almost the same speed, and hence the narrow distribution of molecular weight. You can add reactive groups to the catalyst and form a reactive species at the end of each of those links. You can also do some very interesting things in forming co-block polymers. For example, here we have the polymer bornene and cyclopentadiene reacting to form a mixed block copolymer. This may also give opportunity to produce interesting materials such as polyacetylene and other conducting polymers, starting with cyclooctatetraene, and also at a very interesting route, starting with benzoylene. You go through this interesting polymer, which can be fabricated into materials. The interesting thing about polyacetylene is it has some fabrication problems, as you may know, and one has the possibility of fabricating this into an appropriate configuration and making the transformation to polyacetylene to heat. These are just a few examples of what one can do with this type of chemistry. Again, NMR played a very critical role in the design and understanding of these catalysts. Now I'd like to close by pointing to some potential opportunities. I did not want to have a long list. I think a number of the opportunities were listed by prior speakers. We can discuss them at length during the panel discussion. But I do want to go back to the fact that in getting to a commercial process, which is the heart of what we're doing in industry, you need good chemistry, you need an understanding of how to manipulate or molecularly engineer materials, you need to keep your eye on the engineering as well as the marketplace. Now, there are a number of examples that one could use as illustrations that are very challenging and will require those kinds of discontinuities, will require molecular engineering and sound engineering principles to get to these processes, and they've been mentioned earlier. There are also some that have not been mentioned. For example, solid alkylation catalysts to replace sulfuric acid with hydrogen chloride. These are real problematic, and they're going to become more problematic in the future. Or liquid crystal monomers. These are specialty catalysts right now, but if one could make some of these materials by less complicated routes and using single-step catalysis, they could become the commodity chemicals of the 90s. Also materials. We have a whole host of materials to choose from, and they've been mentioned in this particular symposium. But don't forget about some of the other ones, such as membranes, as Jim Roth mentioned, or maybe some of the tunnel structures that have been developed, where we have unique tunnel structures in a mixed polyhedra type of material, capable of potential of shape selectivity. Now, there is the possibility for spin-off, and I'm not going to get into these except perhaps in discussion. I don't think in my mind there are tremendous opportunities in biotechnology, and in my mind nobody has yet made the link between molecular engineering and genetic engineering. And I propose to you that in the year 2000, when we go to develop a chemical process, if we're a biologist, we're going to choose biology. If we're a chemist, we're going to choose chemistry. But if that link is made, we're going to choose the best route, and it may well be some combination of the both. In ceramics, there's a possibility of us contributing in the area of solar chemistry. Modified electrodes, microelectronics, tribology and adhesion, and lubricity, and of course superconductivity, which is very hot now because of some of the major innovations that have been made over the past couple of months. Now, I'd like to summarize, and then I'm going to give you the real philosophy. Molecular engineering of catalytic materials is a very rapidly evolving field. It is definitely an evolutionary field. It is not a revolutionary field such as genetic engineering, but it's growing very rapidly. Commercial success, if you're doing research and development in an industrial environment, requires a close alliance of research, engineering, and the marketplace. I've showed you a number of examples. Some of the other speakers have shown other examples. I think this attests to the benefits of molecular engineering. And I believe there are numerous commercial opportunities, and I hope we get a chance to talk about them. Now, Alex mentioned in his introductory comments that, as well as Jim Roth, that there has been some mention over the past few years of a crisis. There's been cutback in research and catalysis at a number of institutions. There's been a decrease in emphasis in even academia in some cases. And I would propose to you, being a student of Oriental philosophy, that in crisis there's an opportunity. These are the two kanji figures, which mean in Chinese kanji, crisis, and the second one means opportunity. Now, the next two slides are the two most important slides that I have to show you, and at the end of my presentation. And that is, if you're an entrepreneur like I am, and you want to do good science, good technology, and want to continue that, you need to make money to be able to support that very costly R&D. The word to make money in the Chinese kanji is mo keru, and this basically is made up of two characters. The first one is shin, and it means to deeply believe. And the second one is mono, and it means people. So if you want to make money, you've got to believe in people. And these are the people I believe in. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.